Yes.
All right, I think we're getting started with the event. Welcome, 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 everyone. We're so excited because this is a Share the Red opportunity, right? March is Red Cross Month, and we are bringing for you the first time a series that we're hoping to do going forward called We Were There. These We Were There panels are a piece of us looking back at what we've done and will help us going forward. So as it's Share the Red and it's Red Cross Month, this is a first time hybrid event. So we're really excited about that opportunity to bring this to you virtually and in person. So yes, we're coming to you live from New York City, and I will hand it over to Doran to explain a little bit more about our panel. Welcome. Thank you.
Thank you all for being here. As Wiki said, this is the first, we're hoping of many. We were there. So the idea of this panel is essentially to look back at some of the most memorable moments in New York City, sometimes for the worse in disasters, and how the Red Cross responded. We feel that recognizing the work of our volunteers and our responders is very important for a few reasons. One, we have a lot of history and a lot of our responders have put in a lot of valuable time into this organization, but it also can help us looking forward and how to respond to these events in the future. Listening to shared experiences can help us plan going forward. So the first topic that we're going to be going over in this, we call it chapter 1 of the We Were There series, is transportation incidents. So transportation incidents is something that is not unique in New York City. Just a few statistics to start us off. JFK and LaGuardia airports see about 3.3 million passengers per month. The New York City subway system sees 2.4 million riders a day. The New York City buses is about 1.2 million rides per day, and that's down since COVID. And the Staten Island ferry sees about 35,000 commuters daily. Additionally, approximately 1 million workers commute into the city each day. So transportation incidents, unfortunately, is something that we've seen before and could certainly see again with a high volume that we see in New York City and the surrounding area. So as we speak about transportation incidents, again, it's very important to look at our past responses, and we're very thankful to have a panel of responders with a wide variety of experiences within the Red Cross. And here to talk a bit more about our panel is Michael David Diaz. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. So my name is Michael DeVoltier. I am a communications officer for the American Red Cross in Greater New York. And this is going to give you a little bit of an idea of the flow for the next hour and so minutes. Basically, we're going to start off with a general conversation. We're going to have introductions to our panelists. We're going to have a general conversation with the panelists about transportation incidents. We have a really great group of panelists who represent different departments, different functions within the organization. Different extensive disaster experience, which they'll talk to you a little bit about. So we're going to start off with that general conversation. Then we're going to move into conversations about 3 different, what we're going to be calling spotlight incidents. And so we're going to have a focused conversation. Will be an overview of the disaster, an overview of our response, and then focused conversations of these 3 spotlight incidents that we'll talk about in a second. That's the general flow. Just a little bit of background about me. So I've been with Red Cross for 16 years, and I have responded in the public affairs function to several transportation incidents. So those include the Miracle on the Hudson, the landing of 1549 on the Hudson, it's about 14 years ago. I also responded in the public affairs function to the Bronx train derailment, just another disaster that we're talking about today, Bronx train derailment in 2013. And then I also responded to a train. There was a train crash derailment in Philadelphia. The passengers were headed to New York. They didn't make it here. And what the Red Cross did is they mobilized here in New York to receive the passengers as they were arriving. So 3 different types of incidents, very complex in different ways, very different. and very unique experiences. So I want to introduce our panelists. I'm going to do a very quick intro, and then I'm going to let them introduce themselves and talk a little bit about their experience. We'll have an intro conversation about these types of responses. So our first panelist is Alec, Cecil, volunteer disaster mental health program lead, American Red Cross in Greater New York. Right here. To his left, we have Mike Emmerman, volunteer, emergency management regional program lead, liaison to government, American Red Cross in Greater New York. Sally Phipps, volunteer disaster response. She'll share a little bit more about her work. I don't know if I got that exact title correctly. American Red Cross in Greater New York. Welcome, Sally. Finally, my friend Dario Diaz, who is the regional disaster officer for the American Red Cross in Greater New York. So we're going to start this conversation off. Round of applause. So we are going to start this conversation off just quickly. Why don't you, or not so quickly, we have some time. So why don't you, each of you could share when you joined the organization and talk about some of the transportation incidents that you've responded to, and share a little bit about your role. So starting off with my friend Alec here, and then he's gonna have to use that one for the other guys. No, that doesn't work, sadly. Or you could scream.
It's an honor.
You gotta hit the button.
Well, welcome. Thank you for having me. I first joined the Red Cross actually Penny after 9/11 in 2001. And I was not actually utilized for that response. But my first ever response to the Red Cross actually was a couple months after that. American Airlines flight 587, which crashed in Queens. So that was my introduction to the Red Cross, was in fact the transportation. So it's a big one. That was the first transportation. I've been so I did some things with the Red Cross for a little while, and then kind of got out of it for a number of years, and then re-upped about 10 years ago when my kids were all out of the house finally. And since then, I started doing disaster mental health locally, and then started doing national deployments, and also doing service to the armed forces. So I run a lot of the resiliency, or have run a lot of resiliency workshops for the Red Cross through SAF, locally around the country, and even a couple times in Germany. And recently, I became the regional program lead for mental health for the region. And in terms of transportation accidents, as I said, that was my first one, and I guess we'll talk about that later. And then I did the one that Michael mentioned, the Bronx train, and that was in 2013. When there was a train derailment in Valhalla in Westchester County, that was in 2015. And there was then I went to 2018, there was a stretch limo crash upstate New York in Skull Highway. And most recently, about 2 years ago, there was a boat capsized in the Gulf in Louisiana. So I went down there. So those are the, I think there's some others. I'm also on this basically Westchester County Airport on their committee that meets about disaster responding, and so we plan exercises. So that's a once a month thing. So I'm keeping my hand in some of this.
Excellent. Thank you, Mike. Thank you, Alec. And Mike.
That's Alec. Mike.
So yes, share a little bit about your background.
Oh, yes, ma'am. Okay,
I'm allowed.
so my cheerleaders now. My history with the Red Cross started in 1979. Don't do the math, that's 44 years. And I needed to be a Red Cross instructor as a scuba instructor. And I came to the Red Cross to become a Red Cross instructor, which I ended up doing in 1979 in the Montclair chapter. New Jersey. And they grabbed me after I successfully passed the course. And I ended up teaching for them. And then a few years later, transferred that to Greater New York, where I was basically teaching Red Cross first aid courses, stuff like that. And then along the way, there was a man named John McGee, who some of you might remember, most don't, but John was a great Red Crosser. And he knew my background with other agencies like NYPD and Fire Department and a bunch of others. And he suggested that I become at that time, a GLOW, a Government Liaison Officer, which has transitioned into what we call now Liaison to Government, LGs. So that was in the early 90s. And Dario and I were talking about this before. We were trying to figure out different sites we were on. And we both agreed that after a while, after 20, 30 years of doing this, they mix together. Lots of the things mix together. So you attribute something to one, which is actually a different one. My responses, the big ones, go back to TWA 800, the 9/11, obviously, steam pipe explosion, a whole bunch of other ones over those years. And my role would be either at the Emergency Operations Center at the EOC or in the field, communicating back to our EOC and being that liaison. So for me, it was usually responding to the command center in order to help run the operation. I think that's about it.
Sally?
I started in 1989. Actually, the Flight 800 was the impetus for me to join the Red Cross because there was so much news coverage, and in every story they talked about volunteers from the Red Cross doing this, that, and the other thing, and I was like, wow. When I first started, I started a Manhattan DAT team. There was one in the Bronx, Brooklyn, and Queens, but for some reason Manhattan's had sort of died away. So I restarted that. I was very fortunate. There was not the large pool of volunteers here as there is now. So I was involved in everything that went on, which was every flight disaster. My first response was actually a flight incident. A plane was turned back going to Washington, the cabin filled with smoke. Even though there had been, it wasn't considered a disaster, they wanted the Red Cross there. And I was really amazed when I arrived with a paid responder. The doors opened wherever we went. You know, everything was closed and locked. Oh, the Red Cross is here. And they let us in. And the respect that the Red Cross had from everybody, the head of the airport, airport security, the passengers, it was really phenomenal. And I was very proud to be a part of the organization, and I still am. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I have to say some thank yous real quick, if I may, Michael. Just want to say thank you to Michael, Wiki, Doran, and those of you that put this together, Dexter's team, and who's supporting it, and everybody else who helped, and to the panelists. I really want to thank you. I tell you the truth, these are like the cool kids right here. So I made it to the cool kids table. So I'm so excited. But no, definitely, these are people who I respect, who I've been looking up to for a long time. So I'm really excited to be sitting next to them. You know, Mike talked about the 70s. You talked about the 80s. I started in the 90s in the Red Cross. So I've been with the Red Cross 26 years. I started as a volunteer teaching, like Mike, teaching CPR, first aid, lifeguarding courses, water safety courses. And then I became a paid staff about 20 years ago. Continued teaching and then transferred to, then became an AmeriCorps. Then I became a staff, and I was doing international youth services and SAF, which is a service to the armed forces. Then I moved on to different positions to the point that where I'm at today and disaster service officer. You know, I was thinking about the different transportation incidents, and you just forget so many things. And you know, Mike and I, as he said, talked about, and Sally. So the ones that I remember, definitely there was a helicopter crash here on the East River. We did also, there was the Corey Lau, the Yankee player, crash against the building. And funny story, today I'm driving, I'm like, I'm remembering the operation, and guess who the two, because one of the questions was, who are the people that ride first? It was actually Mike, Sally, and myself, and somebody else, so it's actually pretty interesting to think about. I remember coming in, and they're coming in on the other side, and we worked that operation. I've worked about 3 train emergencies, the one in Philadelphia, the Hala, and also the one in the Bronx. And Miracle on the Hudson and the back end of that. And then, as Mike said, a fun fact, the transportation of oil and gas is actually incidents with the oil and gas, actually part of transportation as well. So we work those, and we're not focusing on those, but just a fun fact for everybody to think about. NTSB does work those. So those are some of the ones we worked on, and hand it back to Mike.
Great. So I want to ask just a general question. We talked transportation incidents. There's other types of transportation. There's transportation incidents that might not be considered. Could Dario, maybe Mike, kind of explain what is considered when you're talking about the Red Cross and they're designating an incident as a transportation incident? What is deemed so?
Does it roll, fly, move in some fashion, and carry people?
And then, so,
Or goods, by the way, people or goods. You get a train that has, like we just had out in Ohio, you get a train that derails and has damage as extensive as it has. If they weren't carrying people, they were carrying goods. So it can be a lot of things, as long as they have wheels or move or fly.
Yes.
anyone want to add to that?
The only thing to add is keeping in mind, right? So the NTSB considers the gas and oil transportation, because again, it's movement of that supply. But for us, sometimes those will delineate a little different. So for example, the East Harlem, we call it an explosion. The East Village, we call it an explosion. I mean, Lower East Side, there were explosions for us, but pretty much one thing to keep in mind is that we do respond in an all hazard approach. So it allows us to do things the same, but transportation incidents are more those for us in the Red Cross are going to be those that actually have the movement of people or trains or things like that.
Okay, cool. So a question for Sally. What do you think makes these types of incidents unique as compared to other incidents that we respond to from the perspective that you have where you're providing more client-facing support?
I think one of the things, people don't live here for the most part. Certainly the flights that I responded to, it's transit. So you have a different relationship with the people that you're dealing with. I think that's probably one of the, and they're gone afterwards. There's not the same follow-up if there's a fire or a building collapse. It touches more people within the organization. Because there'll be caseworkers and mental health and all that. In many cases, it's that one-off.
And
Thank you. Sure, Michael.
And when people are coming from different places, it's not just that they're from different places, it's the extent of the incident. Are there fatalities? If there are fatalities, now you're dealing with people, relatives, coming in from other places to deal with the situation. If they're injured, where did they come from? What is the support that's needed? So an incident where there's a common carrier, like an aircraft or a train or a bus, different from a fire, a local fire, where you know where everybody is, where they came from. So that's a dramatic difference for our response.
Thank you. Alec, is there anything you want to add on the mental health perspective?
Well, as really was noted, you're primarily, if not exclusively, dealing with people who were not in the accident itself or the incident itself. So they were affected by it. Obviously, it's as extreme as it can get, given the death. And the other thing in terms of people coming from far away or close by, but not being there, is there are a lot of other often agencies involved. So yes, you're likely to have, like if you set up a family assistance center for something like that, there are likely to be a lot of other organizations there. And there's the challenge, which I guess you guys do more than I do specifically, but coordinating and collaborating with all the other organizations that are there.
And I would add just the notion, we're going to be talking a tiny bit about this when we go into our spotlight incidents, of how you have two different locations, the people in different locations, and you have different Red Crosses responding in each of those locations. So
Right.
sometimes it's an international Red Cross responding, an international Red Cross or Red Crescent Society that's responding. So I think that's adds to the unique aspect of these incidents. Another question that I have, and this might be our last question before we go into our spotlight incidents, is could you talk a little bit about how the Red Cross response and maybe the national response as multiple entities supporting has evolved, particularly in the 90s. I think there were multiple responses, multiple plane crashes in the 90s. I was just curious if you could talk about how it has evolved and how it might look a little bit different today than maybe after TWA Flight 800. I don't know if you wanted to touch on that first, Mike.
Being the elder in the group, I think I've lived through 8 or 9 different iterations of Red Cross with the number of management changes, and I think I have a list of acronyms that keep changing by the day. So I have my book of acronyms, and a lot came from the attitude at headquarters relative to how responses were handled. And today it is much more organized than it has ever been at any time. Much more organized, much more streamlined. There's, I believe, and Dario will pipe in on this one, I think we get a lot more support from HQ than we used to get. And I know that on certain responses, it was literally a zoo. People would show up from other venues that didn't understand the difference between Queens and Brooklyn or where the Bronx was. And that was a challenge. So given the kind of assistance that HQ gives now, we have less of that issue. Dario?
I agree with Mike 100%, and to add to that is I think standardization being one of those things that I think has helped. Also, the readiness posture the organization has put together allows us to do a better job to respond as an organization. So when it comes to, for example, a transportation incident, which includes a lot of mass casualty and things like that, there are trainings, there are protocols that actually allows us to know what we're going to do. And then when somebody comes over and plugs in from anywhere, it's clearly understandable what the role is going to be. And again, there's hiccups every time, right? But that's the reality of disasters. But it is very clear on what the role is, but also the partnerships at a federal level, right? So for example, the last, I'll give you a quick example. There was a derailment in Philadelphia that you mentioned. I got the call from the Philadelphia RDO. I was the deputy RDO at the time. I said, hey, Dario, this happened here. And by the way, people are going to start heading over there. That's something that would not have happened in the past. And it's because the Red Cross has done a better job coordinating. And then he was able to communicate with us, look, expect this, expect that. And we were able to then respond and do a really good job because of the coordination the organization has put us in.
And one other thing. Let's not forget technology.
Yeah.
70s and 80s, we didn't have cell phones. We didn't have the internet. We didn't have a way of communicating instantly. We didn't have instant messaging. So if you were in an incident where you didn't have telephone coverage or a ham operator or somebody, it was like, how did you communicate? Today, we almost have too much communication, but we have far better resources.
Just related to like you say about technology, that also applies to the families or people affected, and it can have a pretty large impact, because one of the things that happens in many of these incidents is information is not so readily available. And even when it may be, there's calls for an airline, for example, to release information, but because of cell phones, people have all this information.
Yeah.
And in it's a pretty extreme case, that train crash in Baja. So the people killed on the train, because it was a big fire, they immediately identified the bodies who the victims were, but the family members came and they had been on the phone with their husbands and then died, 5-10 minutes earlier, and now they couldn't get them. and they couldn't find them, so they pretty much knew. And we had to deal with that, even though there was no official, there couldn't be any official acknowledgement or even knowledge yet of what happened. And then it's also harder for the families because then the authorities are requesting, dental records or DNA samples and things like that. So it's one of the hardest things often in responses like this, when there are survivors as well as deceased, is the waiting. And it can take a long time. And so sometimes because of the technology, information will come around through very unofficial channels, and then of course, too many rumors can spread and things like that. Another thing just related to back to the 90s, I think it was actually after Flight 800 that things became much more codified in terms of this transportation incidents at Red Cross. Actually, there was some congressional legislation that makes the Red Cross the primary responder for psychological and spiritual care and transportation disasters and collaboration with the SB.
And one last piece on that. All of that communication is for better or worse, because the amount of misinformation is intense. And now, not only do you get people saying something right up front, but you get 1,000 people repeating it, and without having any true background to what's going on. So in some ways, it makes our job worse. And especially on the government liaison side, we're fighting misinformation a lot, where in the past we didn't have to do that.
Thank you. So I think now we're going to move to our spotlight conversations. So we'll move over to our next slide. We're going to do let's see a second. We're going to talk about 3 disasters over the past 22 years. And I'm going to take it back over to Doran, who's going to do an overview of the disasters, talk about the response, and we'll come back and have a conversation with you all.
Thank you, Mike. So as we've talked about, there's many different transportation events. We appreciate everybody sharing their stories too, and we'd love to hear more of them in general. For this focus, we're going to highlight 3 in particular that we felt really reached out to all areas that the Red Cross actually participates in. But again, there's so many more that we could discuss. So first, we're going to discuss from 2001 American Airlines Flight 587, which what was the plane crash into Queens. Then we're going to go into the Spite Nouvelle Bronx train derailment in 2013. And then we're going to speak about U.S. Airways Flight 1549, commonly known as the Miracle on the Hudson. So those are our spotlight events, but again, we'd love to continue speaking about others because there's so many more. So first, I'm going to give an instant overview of Flight 587 in Queens. So on 9:17 a.m. on November 12, 2001, American Airlines Flight 587 suffered a mechanical failure minutes after takeoff. This resulted in the aircraft, which is en route to the Dominican Republic, crashing into the Bell Harbor section of Queens. In all, 10 homes and 1 gas station were damaged, 4 of which were critically destroyed. Additionally, approximately 60 families from the surrounding area were evacuated. 265 were killed, which includes 260 on board and 5 civilians on the ground. Due to the September 11th attack that occurred just 2 months and 1 day prior to this event, as well as a lack of contact with the flight prior to the crash, all tunnels are closed, all bridges are closed, a few major high-profile buildings in New York City, such as the Empire State Building and United Nations, are evacuated or placed on lockdown. And since they shut down the whole entire city. It's also worth noting that the neighborhood in which the aircraft crashed was reportedly home to a large number of firefighters and police officers, some of who were still actively responding to or dealing with the effects of 9/11. So you can imagine the emotional trauma that this incident added. After the reports came in, a large number of local, state, federal agencies quickly converged upon the scene. So momentarily, we're going to play a quick video from a news clip that's just going to kind of help put the scene and what our first responders and Red Crossers were facing.
Not sure we can.
And as we're loading the scene, you can see on the top right corner, that was the aftermath of the effect. And on the lower right, you can see where the impact was. The two red dots up top where the both engines actually came off the plane. All right.
We rely for now on the eyes and ears of people who are in the area, among them David Solano, who talked to us earlier.
We were getting on the on-ramp on Cross Bay Bridge, and we looked up, we saw the plane fire coming from the left-hand side. It could have been an explosion, or it could have been that the engine was on fire. We're not exactly sure.
Now, are you convinced it was the left side? Because another eyewitness just told Jason Carroll he believed he saw a fire or some kind of explosion coming from the right side of the aircraft.
No, it was definitely the left side because we were exactly getting onto the bridge on Cross Bay.
So that just gives you a little piece of the scene that they were facing. Again, 10 homes and 1 gas station were injured or damaged, excuse me. Shortly after the impact, the American Red Cross responded. It just so happened that during the morning of the crash, hundreds of mental health workers were reportedly attending a Red Cross seminar in Midtown, which was focusing on how to help people cope with the September 11th attacks. A joint disaster operations and reception center was established at the nearby Ramada Inn, as both area residents and family members of the victims awaited news. The Red Cross Aviation Incident Response Team, or Air Patrol, also responded. This team was actually what Alec was speaking of. It was established in the 1990s after the NTSB tasked the Red Cross with providing and coordinating emotional support services to those affected by aviation disasters. Despite the Red Cross still being heavily involved in the recovery operations down at Ground Zero, several resources were diverting and over 115 Red Cross workers ended up responding to assist. Once it was confirmed that all souls on board perished, a family assistance center was established at the Javits Convention Center in Manhattan, where Red Cross trained disaster relief workers, including mental health workers, spiritual care workers, nurses, many of whom speaking Spanish, were on hand to offer support to those affected. The Red Cross also provided canteening services to affected citizens and first responders during the initial response and investigation. The Red Cross of the Dominican Republic also assembled at their airport to assist. The assistance did not end there. For years to come, on the anniversary of the crash, the Greater New York American Red Cross would partner with the New York City Mayor's office at the annual Remembrance Ceremony at the memorial site to provide mass care, mental health, and spiritual care. Getting choked up.
Earlier slide, I'm sure. So we will start our conversation about this incident. We have 3 of you who responded to this tragedy. And I guess my first question would be for Sally. So I know you responded. Can you talk to me about where you were when you learned about this and what your initial Red Cross roles were?
I think it may have been at headquarters when I first heard about it. I was sent to open a respite center right there where the plane had gone down. One of the things, if you have responded, you have a snapshot of what's going on. When I heard about the rest of what was going on in the city and buildings being closed, no concept of that at all. It was very focused on that one area. Because it was a neighborhood, there weren't a lot of people in the respite center. People had sort of left the area entirely. So most of who we were dealing with in the beginning were responders that were, as you can imagine, fairly undone. You know, I have visions of, normally if there's a plane incident, it's in the water or not where I am. And to walk around and see parts of the plane on people's front lawns and their azalea plants and you know, body parts. I don't know how to say it any other way than that, but it was a very intense, like frozen moment. And it was, we were there for whoever needed us. Not very explicit, but it was a very crazy time.
Thank you. Thank you.
I also was the lead for several years for the memorial. So that gave me a different view that introduced me to the people that had been impacted, whose families were part of that. And I would see them year after year, which was an extraordinary thing.
Thank you, Sally. So question for Mike first, and then it might go back to Sally. We talked lots in the past about your perspective work after 9/11. So I was just wondering, how did that shape your response to this incident, given what had just happened a few months earlier?
Okay. This is a hard one. This was 2 months and 1 day after the 9/11. And I remember, I believe that it was Virginia Newborn who had called me. And I was at ground zero with working with some other firemen. And I got my cell phone off, and it was Virginia, and she said, need you for this. And so I ended up going back into the New York, at that time it was OEM EOC, and running into the same people who had staffed the EOC during 9/11. And we looked at each other and we said, oh, here we go again. And it was dead silence in the EOC. Normally it's busy, normally you'll hear stuff, normally there's activity. There was nothing. Everyone sat at their desk, did what they had to do. And I think the common thought was, okay, what caused this one? And then a couple of days later, there was some relief because it wasn't a mechanical failure. It was the first officer's mistake when there was a very large aircraft that took off just before that flight took off. And there was extreme turbulence, and he had activated ailerons in the wrong direction or something, and it actually tore the plane apart. So then you had all the issues that Sally was talking about, and Sally opened the door on this. There is a cost to do what we do. We see things that most humans are not expected to see in their lifetime. There is a cost to that. And I have learned the hard way that it's referred to as special knowledge. And that special knowledge is recognized between responders. And I will tell you that if you're on a site, whether it's a transportation issue or anything, and you run into other responders, you almost immediately know whether they know that issue. In the case of the 587, there were a sea of us, Red Cross, OEM, everybody who knew that. And you're saying, okay, we got to handle this one. And so 9/11 actually made this response much more emotional, much different. Anyway.
So, do you want to add anything to that?
No, but I, to Mike's point, there is that connection with other people that you've worked with. It's instant. And it's very powerful, and it actually makes things run a little more smoothly, because you know people's strengths and weaknesses and history, and there's none of that having to break the ice or anything. It was an instant, and this was after 9/11. It was a very cohesive. Okay, we're here again.
Yeah.
It was a team. It was totally a team.
So I want to move over to Alec, because Alec had joined the Red Cross, inspired after that's 9/11 to help and to join. But was this your first incident?
My first ever response, as I recall. And So I was very new. I really didn't know what I was doing. I probably hadn't even finished all my training. But of course, I don't really remember. But I remember going to the Javits Center and being there for a couple of days. And a lot of it was, you know, I guess I obviously didn't have the same kind of response that you folks did. I now they respond. My first one, I was really just trying to, I didn't know that much about the Red Cross and trying to learn, you know, what gets done. And first, I heard the term water therapy, because a lot of what we do, we go around and we ask people, and the way they make contact, which is the first thing you want to do, ask people if they like some water or something, and see if we can just be there. Obviously, they're not asking for a psychologist or a counselor, and often if you approach from that perspective, people will, I think it's changed somewhat, but you know, that's not the first thing you want to hear. So a lot of it is being there. Really, I think the most important thing to do is show up. And that was something I think I learned there. And I remember, I'm pretty sure I first heard there, whoever was one of the leads for that, it was just the manager, you know, the operation there at the center. He said, just remember, 3 things are important. He was quoting Henry James, and I've used this many times. There are 3 things in life that are important. The first is to be kind. The second is to be kind, and the third is to be kind. And so a lot of it is really that. And then I also went with a lot of folks out to the site, because frequently after an incident, any really nice casualty, we will do that at some point when the whoever's in charge arrange with that, so survivors, family members can go to the site of the incident, and they also have some fellow folks there to be with them. And so I remember going out after that and seeing it, and you know, it was had to be to see, well, this is what we do, but also, you know, seeing what the Red Cross was, it's an organization that shows up, you know, really makes an effort to assist those. There were other organizations as well, but obviously made an impression. They had stuck around for a while, and so, and I still carry. I got, you know, sometimes we get these things on some operations. So I have this little bird here at Redwood, which I got for that.
Thank you. Sally, how long did your response to this incident go on for?
You know, I have
Involvement?
no idea. I wish I could give you an answer, but it was, you know, 9/11 was still happening.
Sure.
So it was, you know, it was back and forth. I was, you know, at the EOC or OEM at the time, with Red Cross, and then 587 got in there. So it was a sort of, it became a bit of a blur. It did go on because I did respond to the memorials every year.
Yeah.
So from that aspect, it went on for many years. But
And Michael, did you,
sorry.
did your, sorry, was it similar where you were kind of working on this response as well as the 9/11 response at the same time, or?
Yes, yeah, the 9/11 response, the immediate response, the sort of like for the public information was about a week, but it went on for months. And this crash was in the middle of still people down at Ground Zero, still working this, still at the EOC. It was less of a staff, but people still in the EOC. So it was going one thing to the other, and then this happened. So it wasn't like calling everybody out. It was, we were there.
Right.
And if you look back, the two of you responded to TWA Flight 800, did you see a difference in, since those regulations, since these processes were put in place, did you see a difference in the Red Cross?
The difference was that 800 was out in the water 10 miles out. This was inland. I had actually worked the TWA 800 operation with the NYPD scuba team. So my involvement with Red Cross was something that was incredibly emotional. I had never received a cup of soup from a Red Crosser, having come off the boat, the vessel, working all day, and going into a tent where Red Cross was positioned, and somebody across a table handing me a cup of soup. I lost it. You don't know what it's like to be on the other side of the table until you're on the other side of the table.
Thank you. For the interest of time, we will answer questions, general questions at the end. But I think now we can move to our second spotlight incident, which will be the Bronx train derailment. So we will be ending on a different light, which is the Miracle on the Hudson, which I think glad we'll be closing on that different type of response. But I will pass it over to Doran to talk about that, and then we'll come back to you guys. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike. At 7:20 a.m. on December 1st, 2013, a Grand Central bound suburban New York train derailed off the tracks on a sharp curve about 100 yards north of the Metro North Spuyten-Duyvil train station. It was in a wooded area of the Bronx where the Hudson River and Harlem Rivers meet. 4 of the train cars left the tracks and stopped just feet before reaching the waterline. The crash occurred on the last morning of the long Thanksgiving weekend, which officials believe limited the amount of passengers that were on the train. Out of 115 souls on board, 4 people were killed and 63 were injured. 11 of those people sent to the hospital in critical condition. Some of the challenges that the first responders faced included assisting over 60 injured people, the possibility of some of the passengers that had been injected into the water, which triggered a response of multiple dive teams from the FDNY and NYPD, and safety concerns as they waited for the third rail to be de-energized on the track. An NTSB railroad accident brief later declared that the accident was caused by speed, as the train approached the curve at 82 miles per hour. This area was rated for 30 miles per hour. This accident caused approximately $9 million in damage and disrupted and delayed rail traffic for weeks to come. That rail line daily saw 26,000 riders. So there was massive disruption in the area. So these are just a few photos from the incident, the Red Cross response afterwards. And in the middle, we have Josh Lockwood, the former CEO of the Greater New York Red Cross, and he can speak a little bit more about the event.
Good morning, this is Josh Lockwood. I'm the Regional CEO for the American Red Cross in Greater New York. I'm here at the site of a train derailment in the Bronx where yesterday 4 trains hurtled off the tracks, killing 4 people and injuring dozens of others. The Red Cross was here on the scene immediately, providing support to emergency workers as well as supporting survivors from this tragedy and providing emotional and mental health support to the families of the victims. We continue to stand by emergency responders and the families. We were here all day yesterday, all night last night, and all day today, and will continue to be here as long as we're needed. We couldn't do this work without your support. Thank you so much.
So as the video said, the Red Cross assistance was provided in 2 primary locations. Our responders immediately raced to the scene and began providing blankets and other mass care support items. They went on to continue feeding operations and supporting first responders and investigators for multiple days to come. Additionally, a family assistance center was opened at the nearby JFK High School, and spiritual care and mental health care was provided by our workers, and they continued to do that for several days to come.
Thank you, Doran. So, different type of incident. This is one that I was involved in the public affairs capacity, which I'll talk briefly about in a second. But I'd love Dario to speak about what the Red Cross response initially looked like, because this was an incident where like many transportation incidents, where there were multiple components to it. So we got to the scene pretty fast. I remember learning about Red Cross responders on the scene, supporting the passengers, the survivors with blankets. And I think there was a lot of interesting pieces to that, where that initial mass care and health services piece. So I was hoping you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, thank you, Mike. It's funny because this one and Valhalla, sometimes I get confused a little bit, so my apologies if I missed something, but I can tell you, this was a very interesting operation because it happened right there in the Bronx, everybody was like, wow. We were just going through, I think, a transition at the time of positions as well. I believe at the time I had moved from mass scale logistics to mass scale logistics planning and had a little bit of different team. And I think there was different changes there. But one thing I do remember is how Diane Ryan and Chris Mercado were the first ones on scene. And I think what was happening is Mercado was picking up Diane Ryan in Inwood or something like that. And they just responded to the scene. I remember at home, I think I might have been getting ready to come to work or something like that. And the first thing I see on TV is Mercado and Diane Ryan. I'm like, how did they get there like so quickly? They were there before responders, which, as you know, we have a pretty quick response by the responders here in Greater New York. And they were there, and I know that Mercado was assisting even with some of the rescue. I don't remember the details. You may recall some of it, Mike, but I don't recall exactly.
Yeah, I had heard that he was providing there was some basic
First aid.
but in the triage.
Yeah, I think what it was because they got there so quickly. I think what was happening is they were evacuating some individuals. Some individuals, I think the smoke was bothering them, and he was supporting that. So I know that Diane Ryan, by the way, so Chris Mercado was a health services director, and then Diane Ryan was a mental health director. So amazing individuals who I've worked many operations with, who always just willing to go on the field and support. They were just amazing when it came to that. My hats off to both of them. And they just got busy right away, started working, and then we started communicating with them. I think I was the planner, I was starting to be the planner at the time, so had to get information, and then we just rolled out. Remember, we had to go down a hill to get to where the staging area was, and remember, it was just a mess getting there. But at the time, I was overseeing the mass scale logistics team, so we were focus on providing mass care, keeping in mind that on operations that deal with fatalities, you have to be careful what you feed, right? So automatically the mass care team, which at the time was a great team, today is a good team, Mike also. They were very aware and said, look, they have to make sure they get meals that there's no bones, if there's chicken, make sure you don't do red sauce if there's blood, so you have to pay attention to those things. And that was a big thing right there that the team had to do. And it's funny watching some of those pictures to remember that. But yeah, it was a very, I would say, I was so impressed with how quickly some of the different activities that were not the regular responders responded, but also because of their training that they have, either in their regular life or just Red Cross training, they were able to support in addition to that, to what their normal role would be.
Thank you. So I'd like to ask Mike, in your role of liaison to government, I know you supported the response to this tragedy. Can you talk about what your experience was like in the early, it was the main part of the response was in the early moments, kind of talk through what you remember and what your role was.
I remember the whole discussion. First of all, when the EOC was activated, it was a limited activation. It wasn't like a full activation you'd have for a larger incident. It was limited, but the one agency they wanted in the room was American Red Cross. And almost the entire discussion was about that hill, was about how to get the victims up the hill. And it was the logistics between the fire department, Red Cross, and emergency services generally. Which was different then than it is now, and its tie-in with the fire department. So it was really a logistics discussion. Yeah, and that was the focus. Yeah.
So mental health was a big piece of our response, in addition to mass care, in addition to the health services. So were you supporting the Family Assistance Center? I guess talk through your role.
Yeah. So I rejoined the Red Cross in the summer of 2013. So this was not long
Great timing.
after that.
Fantastic.
Yes, good timing. And I guess I had gotten to know Diane Ryan, as Dario mentioned, and she was in charge. So I think she must have asked me to come down. And I went to the Family Assistance Center, which was a difficult place to be in many ways. They always are. And my biggest memory is there was, the city has all these folks and they have a city chaplaincy. And I don't know that I don't think the Red Cross had its own spiritual care folks back then.
At the time, we were partnered with DCS.
Correct,
Chaplains.
Right. So we collaborated with the chaplains.
Oh, yeah,
city
they-
chaplaincy, right.
Yes,
right. So I remember there was a rabbi there who was kind of trying to direct things and
Steve.
everything. And well, I don't remember his name anymore, but he wasn't a Red Cross person, but in
No.
any event, he was, I don't know if he was actually in charge, but it seemed that way to me. And he was like telling me where to go and what to do. And he did bring me in to be with a family who had just been notified. We don't do obviously death notifications, but we can be brought in right around that time to be available. Sometimes even to sit with families, but certainly right after to help console them and work with them. And I remember he brought me in and I did meet with one of the families right there in the assistance center. And I think my whole response was maybe a couple of days there, but it obviously, again, another one that had an impact on me. And that was when I kind of really had started to get involved with the Red Cross kind of for real, or obviously I've done a lot of stuff since then. So that, was what I remember. And then not that long after was the Valhalla train crash. And I remember that when we talked about how quickly people get there. And I was at a meeting for that night in Portchester, and I came out of the meeting and I heard about the crash. And, we of course are not supposed to self-deploy, but I just started driving over there. And on my way, Diane called me.
There you go.
And was in the command center there, and I went in and I ended up, running that operation for us, which was, although weighty, it was brief. The whole thing was basically 24 hours. So anyway.
So I responded in a public affairs capacity, serving as the public affairs lead for this job. And I, probably about 2 hours after the crash, I accompanied our CEO at the time, Josh Lockwood, to the scene. Incidents like this are different. They're a different type of public affairs response when there are mass casualties. It's considered a mass casualty incident. We're not proactively communicating our work to the press. We are reactive. And what we do want to do is this was relatively early on in the age of social media, is to just let the general public know, let our followers know that we're on the scene. So that was a piece of what I was doing, responding to Twitter inquiries and then posting some things on Twitter. Early on in social media, this was one of the first incidents where I saw the virality of a social media post and how a social media post can quickly be picked up by the news. So I was posting a photo, mentioning thoughts to those who were affected. The Red Cross is on scene helping in different ways. And a few minutes later, and I don't even know if I got asked, but I saw the tweet for the Red Cross get posted to CNN on their front page. So it really, I think it hit home the power of social media as a media relations tool, and also how quickly something can go out there and everything that you're posting has the potential for being broadcast by the largest news outlets. We had access to an area where we were going in. I didn't interact with press that much because I was in two locations. I was within the police line right around the crash site. And then I was also in the Family Assistance Center. So it was interesting seeing an incident of such size and scope and being covered by so much national, international media, but actually not having any interaction with the press at all. Responding to some basic inquiries, but it was an early type of a response like this. I also responded to the Miracle on the Hudson in a little bit of a different way, which I'll talk about briefly. But that's just my perspective of that, which was unique. And then I know that our colleague Chi and other folks in our department went back to the scene. She actually shot that video that you saw, or or one of our other colleagues. So we're just trying to communicate that just the ongoing work in the days that continued, that followed. And I know our mass care for the first responders continued for several days. So I just wanted to share that a little bit. Is there anything else anybody would want to share about this before we move on to a more?
But I think it's important to highlight, you touched on this, is the access that we have to a scene. And the importance that you and us as responders, not first responders, but supporting teams, the importance of the work that we do, right? We have access to the scene, but also, as Mike was saying, there are some moments that are tough, right? So you're there present sometimes with bodies that breathe or out. And I just want to share that it's important that we understand and you pay attention to what's happening and what is it that you're comfortable with. And I think that was something that we had to deal with this operation, because sometimes you get into the working and getting things done. But then when you start to realize what are you working with, we remember one of our trucks was next to the OCME, the coroner's office bus, and so discussions are happening, and there's a body there, there's not a body there, there's a lot of these things that are happening. And I think that that's another thing I want to highlight is that the access that we get, it's not just any access. As you said, you were down by where the train was, right next to it. We were set up right next to it. But you go up the hill, that's where the media was. So it's a very different game. So we are part of the team that is working the operation, whether supporting them, supporting the clients, but we're there. And I think in this operation, it was very obvious to me how important the role was for the Red Cross. From the beginning, when Ricardo and Diane Ryan got there and supported not only the first responder, not only mental health, but actually people as they were getting out, to the support of the mass care, the media, the different components that we do.
And I think a critical piece to this response, and I think we saw it as well with the Miracle on the Hudson, 1549 US Airways, was how quickly the Red Cross got on scene. I think a lot of times when you have something like this, and I've seen it in other responses here, by the time we get there, the folks who've been affected, the passengers, have been moved somewhere else. Here, with the Bronx Trend Route, we were able to get on scene so quickly, and we were able to provide that critical support right then and there. And I think we saw the same thing, which we're going to talk about, which will serve as a nice segue to our next conversation, which will be the Miracle on the Hudson, something a little bit more lifting.
Well, on the Miracle on the Hudson, the plane conveniently landed right near our office. So.
Yeah. So if Dora, cue the slides.
At approximately 3:29 p.m. on January 15, 2009, the Charlotte, North Carolina bound U.S. Airways flight 1549 flew into a flock of geese just 2 minutes into their flight. It was causing significant damage to both of their engines. Realizing that he was unable to make it to any nearby New York or New Jersey airport, Captain Sullenberg was forced to make an emergency landing in the Hudson River. Less than 4 minutes after taking off from LaGuardia Airport, flight 1549 crashed into the water in the vicinity of West 50th Street. A fleet of private and emergency response vessels raced to the scene, where a majority of passengers had already evacuated and were standing on the plane's wings. Other passengers began swimming away from the aircraft in fear that it would explode. Passengers were mainly brought to 2 locations: the New York City Ferry Terminal between West 39th and West 42nd, and the Port Imperial Terminal in Weehawken, New Jersey. 5 people were seriously injured and a few passengers were treated for hypothermia. It should be noted that the Hudson River temperatures that day were approximately 30 degrees. But out of 150 passengers and 5 crew members, there were 0 fatalities. Here are just a few photos. There's no sound of this one, but just a few scenes of the day. Red Cross leadership and responders received word of the crash immediately after it occurred. The New York City Office of Emergency Management contacted Chief Response Officer Scott Graham by cell phone directly to request assistance. Due to their early notification, Red Cross members were at the scene of the ferry terminal to greet victims with blankets and other mass care item support. The Northern New Jersey Red Cross was also activated to assist passengers arriving on their side of the river. Members of the New Jersey Red Cross also coordinated with neighbors to help dry the clothes of the victims who had gotten wet in the crash. Red Cross mental health professionals, and also responded to the scene and began coordinating with Red Cross leaders and local officials. The Red Cross also provided canteening services to first responders and investigators during the initial response and following days. While some passengers stayed in hotels following the crash, others were booked on flights back to Charlotte later that day. The Charlotte, North Carolina chapter of the Red Cross was activated and met those passengers at the airport once they arrived. Our fellow Charlotte Red Crossers later reported that a large number of the victims that they encountered were still wrapped in their Red Cross blankets that they received up north. In 2016, the movie Sully, starring Tom Hanks, depicted the story of the miracle on the Hudson. When the movie filmed in New York City, they requested that the responders of the American Red Cross who had responded to the scene be included in the production. Responders reenacted their good work that day as extras in the film. And then this is a behind the scenes look that kind of shows it.
No one warned us. No one said you were going to lose both engines at a lower altitude than any jet in history. We're going to end up in the Hudson.
When we got the news that a plane had gone down in the river, the American Red Cross was one of the first to provide mass care to those individuals.
Whoever has miraculously survived this plummet from the skies has about 300 of New York's finest ready to help them.
Seeing the plane with all the survivors on the wing, that image I could never erase from my memory. Having the Red Cross in the making of the movie, we're here to reenact and show the same services that we did the day of. I was really proud of the response that we had and the volunteers that provided tremendous support. I mean, you couldn't write a story with a better ending.
You might have seen Sally. And you might have seen me, because I was an extra as well. I did not. Didn't intend to be, because I was just coordinating, but we can talk about that in a second. So I remember that moment here in the building, sitting on the third floor every single day. But I remember one of the things I remember most about that day. But I remember thinking to myself, so I've been with the Red Cross for a little bit. But when I started, I was telling myself, there's going to be something really big that's going to happen. And I've been here for a little bit. And I remember I've been here for about 2.5 years. And I remember there's going to be something big that's going to happen. There could very well be a plane incident. It could be something else big. It was a few years after 9/11. And I remember the face, in the moment that I saw our chief disaster officer, a gentleman named Scott Graham, walk in a most intense manner to my boss's office, who was the head of communications and marketing. And I thought to myself, okay, that's because I heard the conversation, and I was like, that's that moment that I've been thinking about. That's the moment that we're at that moment. Had that conversation. He had that conversation with my boss and us, and we used to have TVs in our offices watching the news with the communications team, and then we watched actually in those moments we watched the passengers on the wing, and then we saw essentially that there were no fatalities, and it was just an incredible moment. It was an incredible moment. So I wanted Dario to talk a little bit about what he remembers about that day. The early piece of it. What was the office like? What was the situation here like? What was Scott Graham like? How intense was he?
So I actually had to cheat a little bit on this one, and I'll tell you why in a second. I hadn't finished an overnight the night before. At the time, I was a response manager / DPM. We used to call them senior supervisor response. So I was both kind of DPM and response manager. And I finished an overnight on Wednesday to Thursday morning. And then I was actually getting ready to go teach us at that time, or at the time, I was going to teach a CPR class or a lifeguarding class, something like that. And in those days, we had pagers, we had beepers. So we all got paid, beep, beep, beep. And we also had Nextels, Ricky remembers this. And, we started to get activated. And I called Danilo Reyes, who was the response manager on duty here. And he was on scene, so he was not picking up. So him, Miguel, and I believe Mauricio, who's still with us, I believe were the first ones on scene from the team. Mauricio actually was coming from another job and saw everything was happening, picked up the urn and drove it there. And this is the cheating part, because I wasn't here yet. I came in a little bit later. I had to check with Mauricio and ask him some things, and he said, the one thing he remembers about being so cold is that they have only one pair of gloves between the three of them, and they keep just like sharing it with each other. But when I came in, so we got paid, Scott Graham was one of the best leaders I've worked under. And Scott Graham was intense, so when you get paid, I tell Scott Graham all the time that when he asks for something, there's no thinking, we just go and do. So I came right away, and I remember walking in the EOC, and Scott Graham is just very, and literally just uses this thing. We're gonna do this with, okay, so we have this, we have that, we have this, so a lot of coordination. That's what was happening, and there were teams on the scene that Sal will tell you about. I didn't get to go on the scene in that front group. We were then supplying a support later on to the teams on the ground, but it was moving fast when I walked in here. And it was a little, for me, had finished it overnight the night before, so up to a few hours. It was a little bit like overwhelming to see that happening. And then I had to be here the next morning again also. So that's what I remember from that specific afternoon. Like I said, Mauricio, who was that part of the three people that arrived first, said that it was so cold, and he said that the one thing that they were pushing on, I'm sure Sally will talk about it, is socks and blankets was like the big thing, and I'll stop there.
And so Sally responded very quickly, and she was responding from a little bit farther than our office. She was actually, were you at work when you got the notification? Midtown?
I worked on 50th and Park. My boss actually called me and said, well, I guess you'll be leaving. I'm like, she said, there's been a plane crash. And I was sent directly to the pier.
Yeah. But what was the scene like? I mean, it must have been surreal to see.
It was completely surreal. It was slightly chaotic. There were police interviewing passengers. So there were different clumps. And in the middle of all this, one of my Dario was there. And this man walked through absolutely broad straight, and I mean it was chaotic and people and he just walked through without a strong presence, and Diego said, that's the pilot, and I was like, no way. He's like, that's the pilot. I mean, his presence was so extraordinary. But to your point, the socks were really a very welcome, loved item.
Yeah. Would you mind sharing the story that you shared with me a couple of years ago about the importance of just the fact that you passed on a cell phone to somebody?
Oh, I had my own cell phone, and then I had the Red Cross Nextel, and there were two ladies standing together, and one of them said to me, can I borrow your cell phone? And I said, sure. So I gave her my personal cell phone, and then went about and came back a little while later, and she handed it to me, and about 2 weeks later, my phone rang. And I didn't recognize the number, so I almost didn't pick up, but I did. And it was a man, and he said, my wife was on that flight, and you lent her your cell phone. And until that moment, I didn't know if she was dead or alive, and I'm just calling to thank you. And it was an extraordinary moment, because so much of it's that instant moment you have with people and you never see them again. And so this was a connection. I was able to ask how she was doing. He said, we have a new baby, and she thought she'd never see her again. And she's had this time off from work, and all she just does is hold her. And I said, how did you get my number? And he said, I asked my secretary to go through the phone bill and pick out any number that I didn't recognize. But it was a really wonderful moment of a connection.
Yeah.
The passengers over the years, I've heard from the passengers, whether it was us interviewing them for videos or hearing them speak at events, they still remember those Red Cross blankets, and a lot of them have the Red Cross blankets with them today.
Yeah.
And it's just incredible just how important something as simple as a blanket was in that incredibly terrible yet cold moment.
It was really freezing.
It was freezing.
Yeah.
I walked afterwards with Diego. What's one of the things that we were waiting for with the passengers? There were a lot of them on business trips. And so their corporations put them up in hotels right away. But for those that didn't, we were waiting for the Red Cross to get a hotel, I think it was in Queens. And we had buses, and then we would put people, the passengers that needed a place to stay that night on the buses to go to that site. And you mentioned spiritual care. There was a rabbi on the bus, and he said, you know, can I pray with you? And somebody was like, I don't care what religion anybody is. You take your prayers.
Michael, talk about your response to the capacity.
Okay, so I was at that time Scott Graham's volunteer partner. And this goes back a ways. And my office was at 51st and 6th. And my window of my office had the view of a small area of the river where the plane actually stopped. So first I got a call from Scott. Then I got a call from somebody from the fire department. And then I got a call from somebody from the scuba team, because they all knew where my office was. And I had 3 phones going, and I had and I became the command center for telling him what the hell was going on. And it was very confusing. So I didn't get a chance to go outside and freeze with Sally, but it was this moment in time. And then and I'll never forget this. My role moved from Red Cross to PD and then fire, and there was an argument about where are they going to put the plane.
Yeah.
And the issue was if they didn't tie it up right, it would sink. So there was this whole thing about what's the best place to put it, because if it sank, it would only go down a couple of feet. And there was one pier down along the river, and they actually took the fuselage down there, and then they had to guard the fuselage for as long as it was there, because they were afraid that people would come in and do stuff. So it was a weird set of circumstances. It was great because nobody died. That was the big thing, was that it was a positive outcome, but it was insane.
Sure was. Just before we move to final comments, I did want to hear a little bit, or would love to hear from Sally about being an extra in the movie. What did you think? What are your recollections of that day?
It was very wet day. And I did offer Tom Hanks a Red Cross blanket. But he was like, oh, I'd love one, but yes, I can. It was great, because they had, Clint Eastwood as the director had wanted real people. And so the real Red Crossers that responded, fire department and police, along with, you know, actors and SAG members and one thing or another. And it was a sort of a reliving in a way, something that had happened, but it kept repeating.
Yeah,
We had to do it on numerous occasions.
Same thing over.
There was a moment which is stuck in my mind. We were lining up for a meal that they had set up, and they made an announcement that SAG members were first. And I was in the line, and I sort of said flippantly, oh, well, I'm not a SAG member, I hope nobody minds. And this woman turned around and said, I mind. And I was like, and so I sort of went to slink away, and everybody else was like, no, you're a real person. You're a real person. You get in the line. It's all right, you get in front of me. And a little while later, the woman came up to me and apologized. And she said, I didn't realize you were a real person.
What did she think you were?
But you know, they had extras, and extras, I guess, take all the food that SAG members dues pay for. And but it was people asked about the response, so it was a reliving from that standpoint. What was it like? And it was a privilege. You know, that's one of the extraordinary things about the Red Cross, is, you know, all the opportunities you have, you're there helping people, but it's still a privilege. And you're not, you're very conscious that I'm not Sally, I'm Red Cross. And wherever I'm going in, who I am sort of ceased to exist. And I become this organization, which is something that we can be so proud of, to be a part of.
Yeah.
And I know I've made a difference in that role for people.
Did you want to say
Yeah,
something?
just
Dario?
two
One last
things,
comment.
two things on that real quick. One of them was, a hot topic, the black box was put in one of our coolers. So actually, we had to we had to go pick up a cooler. I don't remember who went, but I was with Shiv, and we had to send somebody to pick up a cooler. I remember the plane looking very small when it was in the water, right? And it was like hanging on the side almost, and it was like tiny where they put it by that thing. The other thing I think was neat was, when the movie then premiered, actually, we were invited to be part of the premiere with the actual people that were in the plane, the actual victims of the disaster. And we were there sitting with them in the same theater. And it was so interesting to see the connection that people had, again, and I was more an outsider in that sense because I was impressed with you there. But just seeing the connection that people had. I remember watching a movie that Dottie, who I have to mention her, Dottie wasn't seen, and then Dottie was the one voice you heard in the movie, and it was like, look, Dottie is amazing. But I think to see the engagement, and I think it goes back to the importance of what we do in the mission. Our mission, right, is that you were invited to be there, be part of the experience because you were there. You're part of the team, so I think that was pretty neat to see.
So I want to close with one question. And this is not about this incident, it's just about transportation incidents in general. If you keep your answers short for the interest of time. If you don't have anything to say, that's fine. But what's one piece of advice you would give to someone who's responding to a transportation incident for the first time? And we'll start with Alec.
Well, you want me to be brief? I'm not really sure. I guess my reaction to what Sally said is that it's still about you. I mean, being part of this organization is something that really matters. And so you matter, and yet it's not about you. I think that's the basic advice, is that you're part of the mission, and that's what's important.
Thank you, Alec. Mike?
I would basically tell people to remember that you're part of a team. And that team is the support network. That team works together. You're not alone, you are a team. On that subject, sitting over there is my wife, Patricia Stockhausen. Pat was a Red Cross responder and worked transportation scenes dealing with the families of victims. She's not doing that right now. But for any Red Crosser who does this work, who does the difficult stuff of going to the field, having a spouse that understands what you do and appreciates it is a blessing.
I'm not sure from my standpoint, there's a big difference. You're there to support people, human beings, and whatever it is that they're facing that's traumatic, life-threatening. It doesn't really matter if it's a plane crash or a building explosion. So I think from my standpoint, there's not a big, the nitty-gritty response part in the back is probably different, but from what we do on the front end, you're there to support people who are facing their greatest need.
I will say two points, which is be present and be aware. Be present because you don't know what is happening. It's very different in the sense that some are unexpected things that are happening, right? So a fire, we know what to do. The firefighters, the police department, everybody kind of knows what they're doing. And not that they don't know what they're doing in one of these incidents, but there's so many new variables that don't happen all the time. And then people may miss some things, right? So be aware, be present, because something could challenge you or can challenge others. So again, the way you're behaving, the way, and so many things that you have to be aware of. I'll give you a quick example. I did a response where I almost stepped on something that I should not have stepped on because it was a new incident. It was a total different incident, and somebody called me, and fortunately it didn't happen, but it was something that was not other norm. So be aware, be present.
Well, thank you all. So we don't have a lot of time for questions, but we have time for a couple questions if there are any. Rich,
I want you to ask you, when you had to bring the blankets over, there's such a short time, people getting off of the plane. How did you get the blankets over and how many were you able to bring over? Did you run with the blankets? Did you have
They ran down the street with them.
As people got off the ferries and the boats, into the pier, they were handing blankets. But as I said, socks were really the thing.
You get them, but the building only has a certain amount of blankets somewhere. How did you grab them and go? You just grab them and go?
I think it was just.
Well, they were, I think they were, the herbs were always fully stocked. So I think that was a pretty seamless. I mean, I was recipient at the other end. I wasn't the one having to get them down there. But
We're so close to the building.
Yeah. Any other questions?
Yeah, so my question is like, when it comes to those really like big chaotic jobs that are so different, like what is the standard of procedure? Like, how do you know where to start? Like who's in charge, the operations, what to focus on?
So again, all hazard approach, Ben, the person on the scene first is in charge, right? Just like you do every day in response. So you show up there, you start the operation, and then we escalate it up. You know, and today's team will be the RMs, the DPMs, and so on and so forth. And that's really what happens. But I think back to what Mike and Sally have been talking about, and I think even Alex talked about, we're a team, right? So I gotta say, something I do respect about everybody in this organization, when we're in the hot seat, nobody really worries about who the boss is. The boss comes out, right? So again, I showed up to an operation with both Sally and Mike. They were the bosses, right? But I was the operation person at that moment. I took the lead in what I was doing. They took the lead in what they were doing, and that's what we do. But yeah, the procedure is first person on scene is in charge. So then they're tagged somebody else.
One last thing to add to that.
Of course.
I'll do it quick. The value of knowing the other person at a scene in a different role is priceless. If you know the people at the other end of the phone or at the other end of the conversation and you know their capabilities, it works. Where it doesn't work is where you don't know someone's capability. You have no idea what the background is. So my thought to you is get to know all the people that you interface with as much as you can.
My question is, how has the relationship between our services and the city evolved? You know, like the world of nice one is playing these days, or in general, how have you seen that evolve? Or is it better or worse? Or
You sure?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. It has evolved in that when you talk about creating shelters and stuff, you know, the city has taken their position versus what the Red Cross used to do. And they call us when they need us, which is fairly often. And but the relationship is terrific, meaning that we get usually, other than the fire department, police department, we get the first call. And they really need us because they know the capability. And there is a respect that sits there. When I go into meetings at the EOCs, especially the main EOC, there is a respect when the Red Cross person walks in. And especially if they know you. And then if there's a discussion, you're part of the discussion. You're not an observer. You're part of the discussion to help resolve an issue about how do we get the stuff done. So there's a very valuable relationship.
And we're bringing to the plans. That's the key, right? So we're bringing to the plans and we practice the plans. There's an exercise coming up that we'll be playing with them. So we are part of the team already. So it's great.
And we are, for the most part, volunteers. So we're working with people who aren't, who are paid responders or paid doing whatever their jobs are. And so there's sort of an acknowledgement of that early on that people are there out of choice. we're their managers.
Thank you, Sally. I think we are at time, so I think we're gonna close. I just want to say thank you to Alec, Michael, Sally, Dario, the woman behind the curtain. Thank you. Take the heart. Very, very.
Thanks.
There's still some pizza left.